Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Emonee LaRussa and today we're doing something a little special. So some of you may know that I have started a nonprofit called JumpStart Designers, where our mission is to provide computers and Adobe CC to underserved communities. Because as we all know, digital art is a very expensive career field to get into. And I think a lot of kids are missing out and they could be a part of something that's really big. So today, I'm proud to announce that MSI and JumpStart Designers have partnered up and we are going to make great content and they are going to donate some computers to JumpStart. Not only do we get to make great content like this tutorial I'm going to go into, but I'm also going to be a judge for this year's MSI Creator Awards. So today we're going to go over the entire process breakdown of how I created this. I created this for the Creator Awards and I'm super excited to be a judge because I get to look at everyone's submissions. So let's hop into the process breakdown. First, I needed to sketch out my idea. I knew before I had started, I wanted to put this text in this really cool environment that represented me as well as my art style. So I sketched out the foundation and the perspective that I knew I was going to draw. And then I wanted these columns at first, but then I really loved the style of these open windows more. Then I wanted to create a bright and sunny environment. So I added these cool sun rays and I added a mountain landscape in the background. I knew I wanted to create a reflective floor, so I added the shadows. Now that I have my sketch, let's move this over to Illustrator. First, I start by importing my rough sketch into Illustrator. And then the next step is making sure that I can trace some paths over all of my shapes. I'll show you all the best tools that I use to recreate my rough sketches. So I initially started with the curvature tool because there's so many round edges that I thought this would be the best tool for this, but it was actually the opposite. I was having a hard time actually getting these corners to match my actual text on here. So I ended up moving to the pencil tool instead and more freehanded like in my initial rough sketch. Because I'm using this freehand technique, some of my edges are a little rough, so I'm going to use the smooth tool just to smooth some of these edges out. Next, I'm going to start recreating these shapes. To create this window, I created a rectangle and then I grabbed the two dots at the top and I did that by holding shift on each one and then bringing those down so that the edges started rounding in. And then instead of recreating this window again, I'm just going to hit Alt-click on the shape and then drag it over to duplicate. Next, I'm going to change the perspective to make it seem like there's some dimension between the walls. So I'm going to duplicate the window and just kind of create a border around the window to make it look like you could kind of see that there's a good inch or two between the space of the window and the wall. One of the hardest things for me is understanding the color and design, and so I use a lot of photo references to get a good idea of what I should do. So here's some photos of some windows on Coliseums that I thought was really great because the light is shining through and that follows my rough sketch with the sun being directly behind it. So I want the inside of the window to have depth in it, and so in order to do that, I want to add this white rim light inside of the window to make it look like that. Next is color. So what's interesting is that you're going to see me use a completely different color palette than what I ended up actually going with, which is what typically happens when I'm working on stuff. But I'm going to use this gradient tool to create the background of the sky because that's what's shining through these windows. Next, you're going to see me create these three squares where I'm going to fill the color that I'm going to use. And the reason why I'm using this instead of my library color swatch, because in order to use the color picker in the gradient tool, you have to have a color that's already existing in your artboard. You can't use a color that's in your libraries. Next is just color this whole thing. I'm going to continue using these gradients throughout. For the sky, because it's very linear, I want to make sure that the windows and all the reflections match that. Then I'm just going to duplicate the windows over to the left and right. Next, I'm going to do the background. This is going to be kind of an illusion. So typically when you're making backgrounds, you're going to think that that's the sky, but actually the sky is inside of these windows and the background that we're creating is going to be the inside of the walls of the windows. Next, I wanted to create this wide angle perspective and I thought I would be able to sell it well with the lines on the ground. I tried to just eyeball it, but just to make sure that my perspective was absolutely correct, I went into After Effects, created a grid, turned it 3D, then rotated it to a ground level. Then I exported that out as a PNG and brought that into Illustrator and traced my lines over that. Next, I wanted to create that reflective surface. So I want this checkered board style. And so what I did was I highlighted all of my paths and I used the shape builder tool, which is Shift M on your keyboard. And I made them all individual squares so that I could affect them separately. Because what I'm going to do is add a gradient on each individual square. Next was the sun and its rays, which was pretty easy to create. I created the circle as the base, and I created one triangle and repeated that. And you could do that by going to Effects, Distort and Transform, and increase your copies and rotation so that it perfectly repeats itself in a circle. If you're doing something like this, you want to make sure that the anchor point in which it's starting is at the top center of the shape. Next, I created some cute little clouds with my pen tool. Then I created a custom gradient for each individual cloud. So this is the third gradient option that you could choose, and it's honestly one of my favorites and underrated. You could place where each individual color needs to be, instead of your traditional radial or linear gradient. So I'm going to bring my Illustrator file into After Effects. You'll notice that the ground is gray, and that's because the layer that I had over it was an overlay. So I'm just going to reapply that back in After Effects. But before I do that, I want to go in and label all of my files. First thing I'm going to do is make sure that the rays are behind the windows. And in order to do that, I need to set matte the rays inside of the windows. And then I'll do the same for my clouds. Here we have the gray floor with the overlay blending mode. I'm toggling through the different blending modes with Shift plus and Shift minus on your keyboard. Next was a fun little trial and error. So I wanted the text to be chrome, like in the final, and I did this Photoshop technique where I used the bevel and emboss and some different chrome looks in the filters, but it just didn't give me the look that I was looking for, and I ended up using a different effect later in the video. Next, I'm going to show you how I created this shadow very easily. So I just used the corner pen tool and just used the anchor points on each side and brought it down so that it skewed to make it look like it was reflecting onto the floor. So at this point, I was already hating this color palette. I don't know what it was, but it didn't work for me. So what I did, instead of recoloring to a whole different new color palette, I turned it all into grayscale. And what this allows me to do is be able to throw on a tritone, which will change the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows to colors that I want. Instead of having to recolor all of this in Illustrator, I could just recolor it in After Effects with one simple effect. Before I move further, I'm going to change this from 1080 to 1080 to 1920 because that was the correct specs that I should have been working in. But here we have our scene completely in grayscale. We're going to add an adjustment layer, throw the tritone effect on it, and now we can change the values of the whites, the grays, and the blacks in this scene. Next, we're going to jump back into the chrome look on the text. So we're going to use one of my favorite plugins by Red Giant called Prism Displacement. It essentially uses the highlights, midtones, and shadows to create this displacement. What I find to be really cool is you can customize how crazy you want this displacement to be. Next, I'm going to add the final touches, which are these stars. I'm going to lock my main composition so that I can look at it while I'm in my pre-comp of my stars. That way I can move it around and make sure that it's exactly where it needs to be in my main comp. Then I'm going to pre-compose everything so I could put my added textures. First, I'm going to put on CC'd lens. This is going to widen my shot and make the edges look like it's stretching. So if you're wondering why it wasn't touching side to side on the edges, that's because I could basically hide it with the CC lens because it stretches the ends of it. Then finally, I'm gonna add Noise HLS. I love this grain. It looks super nice and I think I throw it on absolutely everything. I would say that the big thing that you want to focus here is the soft gradients. So the technique that I'm using, I grabbed a lot of inspiration from like old surrealistic paintings by like MC Escher, Salvador Dali, and I noticed that all the pieces kind of seemed really soft, and I've been noticing that trend a lot more lately. And being able to master the gradient tool in Illustrator is going to be your best friend in this. The only issue is that when you're using that tool, I don't know why yet, but After Effects hasn't really understood how to import that in. So when I'm importing these shapes in, it's coming in as the Illustrator layer. Typically, when you're using Illustrator files, you want to convert them to shape layers because you have a lot more flexibility in After Effects. So instead of bringing in the Illustrator layers, you just convert it over to a shape layer, and now it's a vector layer instead of the compressed Illustrator file. I'm hoping that within the next few months, Illustrator and After Effects kind of figure that out because it's such an amazing tool and it's a really easy way to be able to create these soft gradients. So when you're working on something like this, obviously you're going to be making something a little different. Keep in mind that there are those limitations with the different tools. And that's going to be it for us today. I'm super excited to be a part of this. Thank you, MSI, for partnering with JumpStart Designers. I think this is going to be something that's really, really huge. If you guys want to hear more about the Creator Awards, definitely look at the description below. I'm going to put some information down there. But thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.